Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. I am noticing that there is a paradox that is woven into each one of the judging functions. The judging functions being extroverted thinking or effectiveness, extroverted feeling or harmony, introverted thinking or accuracy, and introverted feeling or authenticity. So the four decision-making functions that all of us use to determine value, worth, the should statements of life. And the more you look at these functions in isolation, the more it appears as if the thing that they truly want is literally impossible to attain.
When we talk about what they want, we can actually look at the nicknames themselves, and that gives us a lot of the intention of those functions and how they're making decisions. So introverted feeling, authenticity, is looking for the thing that's most authentic. Accuracy, introverted thinking, is looking for the accuracy in the decisions it wants to make. Extroverted thinking or effectiveness is looking for the most effective decision. Extroverted feeling or harmony is looking for the most harmonious decision that meets everyone's needs.
Okay, so then why is there a paradox, according to Antonia Dodge? What is it about each of these functions that wants something that it can't have? And I think the answer to that is each one of these functions in isolation, not paired with other functions that, of course, color it. And of course, none of these functions can live fully in isolation. So this is a thought experiment. But part of this is recognizing how these functions influence us. So even though no function lives completely in isolation, still understanding its foundational desires helps us understand how they're influencing us and why we do some of the baffling things we do. Because some of these functions have very odd, contradictory desires. And I think where the paradox comes in is the purity of the desire, or rather the desire for purity, meaning that extroverted thinking or effectiveness has a desire for things to be ultimately effective. It has a desire to create a machine or a system that is self-generative and is fully homeostatic. Like it doesn't need any maintenance. It just runs. And I think when you look at whatever is the purest version of that desire for each of the functions, you can see why people have such a hard time dealing with the contradictions even within themselves, because a huge part of life is reconciling contradictory things, reconciling what we want with what is, and our ideals with what we're actually working with, and the things that we want to bring into the world, and then trying to find a middle ground between what everybody else is trying to bring to the world, and not trying to dominate over them with our ideal. And each one of these judging functions in some way is highly idealistic. We've talked a lot about how introverted feeling or authenticity has a reputation for being the most idealistic of the judging functions, the four judging functions. But I would argue that all of the judging functions has a touch of idealism to it, because it has an ultimate end game of what it thinks things should look like. And it does its best to implement those things. And it tries very hard to honor that desire to implement. And when it doesn't meet its expectations, there are some judging functions that are a little bit more open to the feedback that it didn't ultimately get what it wanted. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't continue to strive for that thing and continue to want that. And I think that's the paradox. The paradox is that I want a pure expression of this thing, and I will never get it. So therefore, I'm going to constantly and perpetually strive for that, even though I know that it is unattainable.
This unattainableness, is that a word? Unattainableness? I think it is. It is now. This inability to obtain that ideal that you want from the judging function in your personality is, on the best side of it, something that creates this desire, this longing, this pining for that ideal expression. On the worst side, it can create addiction and compulsion and some bad behaviors, obsessively, compulsively going toward this ideal expression of that function. So as an example, let's just bring this down to a tangible example for a moment. As an ENFP in the Myers-Briggs system, my primary judging function is introverted feeling or authenticity. The ideal of this function is that all my decisions will be made with a pure form of authentic motivation coming from within me. In other words, when I donate to a nonprofit that helps the poor or something, let's say I take the action to donate, that my motivations and desires and reasons for taking that action will be authentic and pure and won't have corruption woven into my motivation structure. Well, I know, because I'm me, that that is never the case. Now, I can lie to myself. I can obscure the truth. But every action I take, I know there is corruption and impurity in my motivations to take that action. I just know it. There's a percentage of that. There's a lot of positive intent and positive motivations for why I take actions, but there is always going to be corruption, some inauthentic reasons that I do something, or some extra authentic reasons that I do something. So that's an example from my personal case, but each one of the functions has one of these.
Well, let's talk about introverted feeling. I mean, you've already started it, so let's tip it off with that one.
Sure.
Shall we? So I think there is a desire for purity of intent, but I think even more so is that because introverted feeling is obsessed with authenticity, it's constantly asking itself, who am I? What is authentic for me? And when you start to go really far down that rabbit's hole, the answer is, I am filled with contradictions. Meaning that every action I take is going to be honoring a part of me, but it's also going to be dishonoring a part of me.
Yeah.
So which is the authentic part? The part that I'm honoring to do this action, or the part that I'm ignoring? Is it inauthentic for me to ignore that part? But then if you don't ignore parts, then you're never going to take any action, because every action is going to, is going to represent a piece of you, and every action is going to, by definition, not be representing a piece of you.
In the TV show The Good Place, there's a character named Chidi in this show that can never make a decision for this very reason. My suspicion, he's probably an introverted feeling authenticity user. He's incapable of making decisions because he's always worried that there's going to be corruption into that decision. Like, it's not going to be as authentic as he wishes it would be.
Well, and it's not going to be moral.
That's right.
It's not going to be honoring some higher moral ethic. If you don't think Chidi's leading with introverted feeling or has introverted feeling, it doesn't matter. Don't come tell us what type Chidi is.
I'm not trying to type guess him. I'm just saying, like, I could look at him with an introverted feeling frame and see that playing out.
I think that it's a really good illustration of one of the challenges that this function has. It wants to honor itself, so therefore it dives deep into itself, and therefore it sees all of the contradictions within the self, and therefore it can never actually truly be 100% purely authentic. Like, its very desire to attain the thing of authenticity it disqualifies it for ever actually reaching it. And so therefore it has to keep digging, keep trying to reconcile all these parts, keep trying to do parts integration, basically, knowing that the further it goes down, the more it's going to run into contradictory elements. So the paradox of introverted feeling or authenticity is to be fully authentic while occupying the contradiction that is being a human being. And so it continues to run into this hamster wheel. And that doesn't mean it lets go of the desire to be authentic. It's not like it finally goes, I guess authenticity isn't a thing. Like, it still wants it. It's still trying to have it. It just can never quite get there because authenticity is a contradiction in terms.
It is a contradiction in terms, only if you're looking from the external world, though. Because if something inside of you is contradictory and you quote-unquote label it inauthentic, well, you still made that decision, so it really is authentic. It's making peace with yourself internally that there is no ideal, perfect reason for this. You just decided it. And so it has good motivation and bad motivation woven together, and you're going to execute on it anyway. And you're going to accept the corruption that comes with it.
Which is why the paradox of the desire for it without ever actually being able to obtain a pure expression, to keep working on that paradox actually ends up giving birth to sovereignty. That's the interesting thing. You'll never quite have 100%. I mean, if you're defining authenticity as like literally anything that emerges from you, then everything's authentic. But I don't think that's how introverted feeling usually sees it, at least at the beginning of this journey. But if it gets to a point where it's really seasoned, it will get to a place where it recognizes that it's allowed to show up the way that it wants to show up. It's allowed to have self-authority and sovereignty. And it's because the perfection of being 100% moral or ethical or, or authentic or whatever is the, is that like characteristic guru at the top of the mountain, right? By the time it does the full climb all the way up, it realizes that at the top of the mountain, there it was the whole time. It's itself. And so it gives birth to these great characteristics, which is why there's value in the paradox. But it has to be explored. That paradox has to be explored to eventually understand that it's not really authenticity you're looking for. That just is. You're actually looking for sovereignty.
So let's roll over to your judging function, Antonia. Introverted thinking or accuracy. How does this show up in a paradoxical way for you?
Well, introverted thinking has a lot of corollaries to introverted feeling, unsurprisingly, since they're both introverted judging functions, right? They're both decision-making functions that come from a subjective, personal angle. For introverted feeling, it's how do things make me feel? What's authentic for me? For introverted thinking, it's what's true. And the voracious paradoxical appetite that introverted thinking or accuracy has is what is accurate, what is precise, whether it's paired with a more realistic, grounded function or it's paired with pattern recognition. It doesn't matter. It's still looking for what you could argue is true, right? The calibrated behavior or the calibrated thought that reaches the most precise conclusion, whether that's like, hitting a hockey puck into a net, right, at just the right angle, that self-discipline and practice and doing things over and over with precision allows you to ultimately accomplish, or whether or not you're doing that with a thought and trying to determine what facts are and the truth of the universe. It doesn't matter. It's all about precision, optimization. And the challenge with introverted thinking is that its voraciousness for truth and facts and precision has to, at some point, recognize that in order to be pure in its thoughts in one arena, it has to, by definition, be ignoring a bunch of other information. It has to choose. Just like authenticity or introverted feeling has to choose the part of itself that it's going to, weigh toward to take this action. It's going to be paying attention to this part of who it is to show up in a certain way. Introverted thinking has to pay attention to a certain set of pieces of information. It can't see the whole picture at any given time because there's just way too much data. And there's contradictory data in there. Two things can be equally true at the same time. It's the paradox of life, right? There are all sorts of things that are contradictory. So introverted thinking has to make choices about which things it's going to pay attention to. And it can't ever know whether or not it's truly right. It can't ever know whether or not it is landing on the truth.
So I gave an example of introverted feeling, authenticity, making a donation to a nonprofit, and the fact that there's going to be good motivation and bad motivation woven into that same action. What is a personal way that introverted thinking, accuracy, shows up for you, Antonia, as an ENTP in the Myers-Briggs system?
So I think the challenge that introverted thinking has, in the same way that introverted feeling has a challenge with determining what is honest for who it is, its identity. Introverted thinking runs into all sorts of problems when it tries to determine its beliefs, because every belief means that there is data that goes neglected or ignored. Meaning that when I run into somebody and I listen to their worldview and listen to their belief system, the first question I ask myself is, what thoughts does this person have to ignore in order to land on this set of beliefs?
And that's happening all the time for introverted thinking.
Right. Well, I mean, it is if introverted thinking is a muscle that's being applied. Like all of these functions can be ignored or used poorly.
Yeah, of course. I'm assuming like being used well.
Yeah, exactly. And so if introverted thinking is being used well, then that's the number one question. What's the dissonance? What's the cognitive dissonance here? What does the person have to neglect? What information do they have to be ignoring in order to settle on this set of beliefs? And so when I'm trying to figure out what I believe at the end of the day, it's so hard for me to pin it down. And then when I listen to other people and I hear their belief systems or their full structures of thoughts, and I can almost automatically hear all of the cognitive dissonance that is woven into their belief structure, because just like there's always corruption in actions that are taken for ultimately positive intent when it comes to introverted feeling, all belief systems have a measure of corruption in them. There's always going to be information they're ignoring, neglecting. There's always going to be contradictions. There's always going to be something that they haven't really thought out that well. And so because of that, I can see all of the different, all the different biases and all the different whatever cognitive dissonance has to go into landing on this belief structure. But at the end of the day, that doesn't mean they're wrong. Just because there's cognitive dissonance and all of that, the more information somebody has to ignore in order to believe what they believe, the less likely in my mind it is to be true. And yet at the same time, I can't know that. I can't know that the person is representing a false belief system because truth is not something that is knowable.
So take two things. Obviously, one belief is murder is wrong. You're saying there's corruption written into that. Like there's a corrupt, inaccurate thought when I say that.
Absolutely. Because there are situations and circumstances in which one could very easily justify murder.
Okay.
Which is simply the taking of somebody else's life. It's a non-contextual term for the taking of somebody else's life. We use nicer words, like executing or, manslaughter or whatever. Not manslaughter is not a nice word, but I'm saying that we'll put different styles of words on things to more justify them. But the taking of somebody else's life, the assumption that is always wrong, I think that there are arguments that could be made that that's not always wrong.
Okay. But what I hear you saying, though, in the introverted thinking corruption is there's less corruption in that statement that murder is wrong than if I say UFOs exist and they abduct 1 out of every 10 people. You're saying there might be usefulness in that belief or that worldview, but I'm searching more for the accuracies there than I am in the murder is wrong statement.
Yeah, well, and of course, one of them is a statement of fact, and the other one is an abstraction of how things should be. Murder is wrong is an evaluative, it's a moral statement. Aliens come and abduct 1 out of every 10 people is an attempt to represent, how reality works. So they're not totally corollary in the level of statements. But that said, I think that there are more arguments to be made that murder is always wrong than there are arguments to be made that 1 out of 10 people are being abducted.
Well, and that kind of showcases the power of introverted thinking as well. I know we're getting a little bit tangent here just to get an example, but the fact that the introverted thinking person usually is already seeing those distinctions even before most other people are. I just conflated those two things. And before you even answered them, you answered them directly, but you also separated the two concepts out and said, well, you're in the category of this over here and the category of this over here. Introverted thinking is doing that before it even gets to the accuracy level. It's just defining things clearly and accurately portraying them first.
Yeah, and one would think that kind of discipline, mental discipline, would ultimately lead a person to know truth, but it doesn't. That's the problem with it. Just going deep in an introspection, one would think would lead a person into a place of full authenticity, but it actually does the opposite. It actually creates so many problems in seeing the contradictions within a person. Now it becomes even more muddled, and it becomes a challenge of trying to figure out what is authentic, which ends up, like we mentioned, becoming more about, what is sovereign? And I think introverted thinking does something similar. It ultimately wants to know truth, but at the end of the day, it knows that truth is unknowable. So the exercise doesn't really go to a place of true accuracy. It doesn't actually ever hit the target on knowing facts and knowing the ultimate truth. But it does get to a place of having really high critical thinking. It sharpens the saw of knowing how to think, right? It's you're never going to get to truth, but you can get to refinement. You're never going to absolutely know how the universe works, but you can learn to ask really compelling questions and make really compelling distinctions. And so you can have a clean process of thinking, even if you're never going to ultimately have clean thoughts.
It's kind of like we attempt to live forever. We try to eat healthy as humans. Most of us want to live forever. If we could, we would want to live forever. We don't end up with the ideal, but we end up living long lives if we act like we want to live forever. And we do the behaviors that try to accomplish living into hundreds of years or maybe forever.
Right, exactly. Yeah, we can't actually do it, but the attempt creates good emergence. And I guess if I was going to summarize the word that introverted thinking ultimately gets to, if it's not accuracy, at least there's clarity. Like introverted feeling doesn't ever become fully authentic, or at least it almost transcends that idea of authenticity and enters sovereignty. For introverted thinking, it transcends accuracy and enters a place of clarity.
So we're spending a little bit of time on these two introverted judging functions, introverted feeling, authenticity, introverted thinking, accuracy. And you might be a TJ who uses extroverted thinking or effectiveness, or an FJ who uses extroverted feeling and harmony. And you might be rolling your eyes or like, come on, get to my function. I want to hear my ideals. But the reason we're spending some time on this is because you also have one of these two functions if you're a TJ or an FJ, but it's not one of your strengths, but it's going to inform how you make decisions. So we've spent some time on this because if you're a TJ or an FJ, which we'll talk about in a moment, you're going to have introverted feeling or introverted thinking influencing you, but it's not going to be as sophisticated. It's already an introverted function, making decisions or helping you make decisions in your life. So you can get muddy really quick if you are somebody that is a TJ or an FJ. So as we change topics and move to those are very obvious external world judging functions. We can see these functions, right? Effectiveness, we see the systems effectiveness builds. We see the ways they construct things in the outer world. Extroverted feeling, harmony, we see harmony's impact. We see the social way that they construct things, how they interface with people, how they're striving for harmony. So these are more quote unquote obvious to us in the outer world. But again, remember, they're going to also have an influence in the polarity of the introverted judging function.
Yeah, and I would say that the way it works is that TJs who use introverted feeling or authenticity, because they're influenced by this desire, but they are not persuaded to do the same level of work, what ends up happening is what is authentic to them becomes highly oversimplified. Like there's not a lot of questions about whether or not they're moral or authentic until all of a sudden there is. And now they want to oversimplify, yes, I am a good person, right? Yes, I am doing what's honest for me, even if they haven't done, the real deep work there of determining, well, what are some of those contradictions within the self, and am I honoring the full spectrum? The same thing with FJs. There is a very strong desire for FJs to have facts and truth and be clear of thoughts. The challenge is that if it gets in their way of extroverted feeling or harmony, then it's much easier to ignore or neglect. And so at the end of the day, if it's an inconvenient truth, it's a truth that's convenient to ignore. And until all of a sudden they want to have those facts and that truth and to have clarity, and then it becomes sort of I guess I must be right because I've put some thought into this.
I'm noticing online in the media, there's this category of fact checkers coming up right now. And I'm noticing the media outlet that has the quote-unquote fact checker, checking the facts that are out there. It's interesting to see the perspective and the narrative that publication's coming from. You can almost tell how they'll check the facts. So if it's a subject that, and this feels very extroverted feeling to me, and it could be extroverted thinking, I guess, but it feels very much like if the facts are different, my guy's out there talking or my person's out there talking, and the facts are a little off, but I like this person, I like their message, their narrative, I'll come in and say, well, their fact's a little off, but here's the context you need to have to understand it. I'll reframe it for them. If it's a person I don't like, my fact checking will come, oh, they're lying, they're terrible, look at how horrible their worldview is, they're an awful person, and like they could have said something very similar, but it's interesting to see how the fact checkers, quote unquote, will shape the narrative. It almost feels like backseat or lower stack introverted thinking running cover for a extroverted feeling harmony frame. And that's how I see it, again, from my ENFP nature. I don't know exactly that's happening. That's how it feels to me, metaphorically speaking, or like in Gestalt.
Yeah. Well, who fact checks the fact checkers, right?
The Ministry of Truth.
That's right. Or who watches the Watchmen. And I mean, from an introverted thinking person's perspective, if you can tell the political persuasion of a person who's fact checking, they're doing it wrong. Like I shouldn't be able to know that. I should have absolutely no idea what the person's belief structure is if they're simply fact checking. So if I can pattern it, then they're not fact checking. Then it's a useless waste of time. And so anyway.
So let's talk about extroverted feeling or harmony's ideal around their judging function.
Okay. So for extroverted feeling or harmony, I would argue that the obsession is actually with morale. It's an obsession with consensus, right? Getting everybody emotionally taken care of, making sure everybody's happy, on board, there's the same level of idealism that comes along with this as the introverted judging functions. It's just the extroverted functions gets a lot more real-time feedback, and so they have a tendency to be more open to this feedback. There's a little bit more of like a realistic bent to it. It's like, okay, I guess not everybody's going to get on board. The challenge, of course, is that if we become too one-sided and if there's enough feedback that doesn't contradict the worldview, meaning that the advantage to the extroverted functions is that you should be getting a lot of pushback. That's its point. You should be sending a message out to the world and getting plenty of pros and cons and like figuring it all out and reconciling all that feedback. But when a function gets too much of an echo chamber response, then it can be just as much of a fantasist as the introverted judging functions are when those functions don't get enough feedback. So an extroverted echo chamber is the same level of idealism as an introverted function that doesn't expose itself to the outside world.
So I'm seeing this narrative emerge. I don't want to get into topics or politics. I'm using this as a way to understand extroverted judging functions. I'm trying to get a sense of FJ's, extroverted feeling, harmony. There's this idea that there's systemic fill in the blank in the world on our globe right now. And I don't want to fill in that blank because I don't want to get specific to the topic. But this tapping into this consensus, this systemic fill in the blank is in my mind, as I'm looking at this, a very extroverted feeling or harmony concept. This is the reality. We need everybody to buy into this reality. This systemic fill in the blank is happening. Again, there's multiple of them. I don't want to pick one. And that's kind of extroverted feeling or harmony trying to cast this narrative. We're all in this together. There's this happening to everybody. And the only way to raise morale is we all have to buy into this truth collectively first. Once we all agree on this truth, now we can do something about it. But before I get everybody to do something about it, I have to get everybody to buy into it.
Right. Well, that would be extroverted feeling doing things in an unseasoned way, honestly. Because when extroverted feeling looks out to the world, if its ideal is morale, consensus, and getting everybody's needs met, it has to recognize that when you get this person's need met, oftentimes you're doing it at the expense of this other person. Like, people's needs are just as contradictory with each other as our emotions or our beliefs are. Like, there's always going to be a contradiction.
So it has to be priority put in then.
Right. Just like with authenticity and accuracy, right? Like, how are you prioritizing these things? And oftentimes the fact that the contradictions exist and holding those contradictions and trying to understand them and trying to work through them and reconcile all of it ends up becoming a very seasoned emergent, right? Like, something even better ends up emerging from all of it. But the desire for consensus is extroverted feelings obsession, right? It wants everybody to be on board and it wants everybody to be happy. But that's literally impossible because what makes one person happy makes another person miserable.
Yeah.
And so to create a system that gets everybody's needs met is a fantasy. And at the same time, we can create systems that understand that there is a push-pull to all of these things. It's called tension. And so when extroverted feeling becomes the most seasoned, it's not weighing anybody's needs over anybody else's. It's understanding, and by that I mean as a general rule. When extroverted feeling is still contending with all of this, just like when introverted feeling is contending with authenticity, it'll turn a blind eye to the parts that it's ignoring in order to make this decision. It'll go, this is 100% authentic. And it just kind of ignores the part of itself that says, that wasn't authentic for me, right? Extroverted feeling can start to weigh priorities in terms of pain, right? Whoever's the most in pain. And when it uses pain as a prioritization of who we're going to pay attention to, unfortunately, it doesn't always ask why that person is feeling the pain and whether or not pain in and of itself can be good for that person. Meaning that there are times when we have to feel pain because pain refines who we are. There are lessons that are learned through pain. So if pain becomes a disembodied prioritization structure and extroverted feeling is just obsessed with, getting everybody's pain handled, they lose sight of the utility that pain has. And sometimes you need to let people feel pain.
We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show. I would also add, from my perspective of extroverted feeling or harmony, pain is the most obvious one you can see. And also there's this idea of taking turns. Each person gets to voice their concern, their turn, and each person gets around the table, metaphorically, equal time. And so if a people group has been in power too long or has had to say too much, they've been able to speak too much, and there's a disadvantaged group of people, it's people in power that have had the voice sit down for a moment, however that long that moment might last. It's these other people's turn now to speak. It's their turn at the table. I think extroverted feeling feels like that to me as well.
Well, and that's because it does that beautifully once it's transcended this need to solve all pain. Meaning that, as I mentioned before, there's this concept of tension, right? There's different demographics that need and want different things or will be satisfied by different things. And when extroverted feeling gets past this need to handle all pain, when it stops focusing on pain or victimhood or whatever as the end-all thing that needs to be addressed, it starts to realize that its beauty, its intrinsic gift of responsiveness, which extroverted feeling really is beautifully responsive. It takes this gift of responsiveness and realizes that everything is a tension and everything needs to be sort of perpetually calibrated. Like if we weigh it too much on one side and then the pendulum swings that direction, then we need to course correct and have the pendulum swing the other direction. And we have to just constantly be keeping our finger on the pulse of what all of these needs are and create a full system that recognizes that sometimes we're going to weigh it on this side, sometimes we're going to weigh it on that side, sometimes, things are going to be a little bit out of perfect egalitarianism, I guess you could call it, like this idea that everything is going to be like perfectly balanced. There's no such thing as perfect balance, but there is a way to sort of create a flex and flow of all of these things to make sure that nobody gets fully neglected. And if something has been neglected for a long time, then it's time to bring that, rise that up and look at it for a time and make sure that it gets honored and doesn't get, marginalized. But when extroverted feeling loses sight of that flex and flow, that almost like ocean-like nature of humanity and society, it gets kind of obsessed with looking for the next person in pain. And then instead of having a flex and flow, it wants to grab power and grab, whatever the advantages are from one segment or demographic, and then just unilaterally hand it to another. Not understanding that that's doing a 180. All it's doing is just changing the look of the problem. It doesn't actually change the problem. So when extroverted feeling contends with all of this and understands that there is, again, this flex and flow of all of this, which requires perpetual calibration and perpetual responsiveness, which is no easy thing, by the way. In order to master this on a social level is for me, it's indistinguishable from magic, honestly, because I don't have this. I have an ability to observe it and see it and understand its use and its power, but I don't have the ability to construct it myself. And so it always looks very impressive to me when people are capable of doing this. But that's extroverted feelings, like sort of like final form, is recognizing that these things need curation, constant and perpetual curation, like a landscape. And if you weigh too much on one side and get stuck there, like representing just a single demographic and riding that horse all the way out into the sunset, the challenge is that you are going to be ignoring and neglecting huge portions of society that have opposite and opposing needs. So don't get too obsessed with any single people group. Don't get too obsessed with any specific demographic. There may be a time in which it is required to be seen and observed and raised up, but don't ride that horse into the sunset, because there's lots of horses and they all have needs, right? So I think just like with introverted feeling, lets go of this ideal of authenticity and understands it's actually sovereignty. And the way that introverted thinking lets go of complete accuracy or truth and then instead seeks clarity. I think for extroverted feeling, they let go of this idea of consensus, of perfect equality. Like, it's more about the tension of of the radical word or the original definition of equity. When I say equity, I don't mean like the redistribution of wealth. Your mileage might vary on whether or not you believe that that's something that needs to happen. But I mean equity in the sense of fairness and impartiality. It's a matter of seeing society as having a lot of needs that live in tension, and being willing to get needs met in a way that is truly impartial. Like, we don't show favoritism. Right? We don't go, well, I like that demographic or identify with that demographic, and so therefore that demographic must have, supremacy, or I identify with that demographic so I see its pain, but I don't identify with this other demographic, and so I don't understand that demographic's pain, so therefore it's easy to neglect. It's more of an understanding that it doesn't matter whether or not you identify with their pain. The pain exists, and if you're going to be honest about your desire to eradicate pain, then you're not going to be able to play favorites. You're going to have an understanding of the tension between all of these demographics, and not have these biases. Have the opposite of biases, to understand that whenever we have an imbalance in any of that, it might for a time feel like a win, but over time, those become the marginalized groups that then raise up. So it's a desire to get rid of the concept of marginalization itself, not a simple matter of like moving the pieces around so that marginalization happens to different people so they get theirs.
It reminds me of the Knights of the Round Table from Camelot. I think that's a very extroverted feeling harmony concept. There's no hierarchy around this table. It's a round table. We all have equal voices. And I think that's a very wise way to look at it. I think that's a concept. Now, the challenge comes in that the table literally can't be big enough for 7 billion people. There have to be people that are represented around that table. They can't all be at that table. It's just literally impossible for all of humanity. And I think extroverted feeling and harmony, when it's done well, understands this too, this idea of representation, this idea of someone can represent an entire swath of people and come to that round table and help add a voice to the conversation to get all the needs met. But those representations, the hierarchy is built into that.
Well, and I think when it comes to this idea of representation, I mean, of course, if we're going to orchestrate society in a way that does get everybody's needs met, that means that some who have taken more than their due, have an unearned amount of advantage, have to give up a little bit in order to give more availability to people who have had intrinsic disadvantages. And so there is something to be said for that. Absolutely. That said, I think when extroverted feeling is done again in a seasoned way, it automatically understands the power of shared emotions. And when you can encourage positive shared emotions, when you can encourage the ones that lead to happiness and an understanding of how this, is a better result for everyone ultimately at the end of the day. Really understanding these ideas of give and take and this tension, and doing it through the lens of positive emotions. That usually requires some sort of disruptive technology in society. And when you can replace what is with something that is clearly better for everybody, and in a way that's demonstrated, then extroverted feeling doesn't have to get, I would almost say, lazy by using negative shared emotions in order to incentivize the outcomes it wants, like anxiety or fear or hysteria or anger or whatever it is that they're trying to sort of galvanize entire groups of people around these like really negative emotions. I'm not saying that negative emotions don't need to be processed. And sometimes negative emotions are incentive or like our motivations. I understand that. But when you try to manufacture them right? When you're trying to get everybody on board and on a shared emotion because you're triggering some of those easy ones to trigger that weren't authentic or natural for that person. Like you got them to a place where they're mad because you wanted them to feel somebody else's anger, even though that's somebody else's anger to process. But you want that person's anger to be represented, so then you are lighting anger in others in which it is not their emotion to process. In that way, extroverted feeling can become very manipulative because it's trying to manipulate large groups of people to share an emotion to get an end met when it hasn't demonstrated that this is a better disruptive technology, that this is literally a better way. If it's using tricks and tactics, sort of like low vibration tactics to get its end met, then that's not a very convincing platform to say that this is a better way of going and that everybody's going to benefit from this. Like, that's a very unpersuasive argument, but it's also one that's really easy to tap into. Like, tapping into negative emotions is much easier to tap than to tapping into positive ones. Journalism and the media are an example of this, right? Like when they're trying to sell papers, or I guess sell papers is a
sell papers.
I know, is an old style
this is
metaphor.
a podcast, ma'am.
What would that be called?
We're in the modern times now.
Anachronism, right? Is it anachronism?
Sell subscriptions to online digital newspapers.
That's right. When they're trying to do that thing, very often they will try to hit or trigger negative emotions because it's so much easier to tap into those.
Yeah.
So an extroverted feeling is attempting to get huge groups of people to take action that it wants them to take. The lazy way out, or the tricky way, the emotionally manipulative way, is to tap into shared negative emotions. And that, unfortunately, just like with introverted feeling that ignores the emotions or the parts of itself it doesn't want to see in order to convince itself it's taking authentic behaviors, and introverted thinking ignoring and neglecting thoughts that are inconvenient in order for it to believe things it wants to believe. I mean, there's utility in all of that, but it won't get the person to that transcended place because it's a trick, right? It's just it's something that it's doing to skip steps. When an extroverted feeling understands that it must prove in some way, right? It's an extroverted function. It must demonstrate the superiority of this new way of going about things by tapping into the positive emotional expressions and having that persuasion going that direction. Then it transcends this idea of consensus, which again, when it becomes obsessed with consensus, it will do it through negativity. And that's one of the reasons why it must transcend this piece. When it transcends this idea of consensus and a requirement for people to be in a certain place of morale, then it gets to a place of understanding that it's actually mastering tension. It masters the art of tension. Tension is a balancing act between two polarized things. And when it recognizes that that is its actual, sort of higher end game, is mastering tension and true equity, like the actual definition of equity, which is to be blind to its biases, its social biases, and actually create a world that is equitable for everybody through this tension. Well, that's when it really gets to its true purpose, right? And I can almost feel the comments that we're going to get on this one, which is that people have anger. They have anger that they should express, that there's lots of angry things happening right now. And I wouldn't disagree with that. There is a time period where the shadow of society rears its head, particularly if it's been ignored for too long, and helping create a context that allows for the processing of shared emotion, particularly things like grief and anger, is very appropriate. And I think extroverted feeling, in part, helps sort of create a context that allows for that. But there's a difference between stewarding social emotions that need to be expressed and exploiting them, right? Using them for your end game. As much as you might believe that this is how this level of shared emotion will never be created again, you can't prevent it. Like collective pain is part of the human experience. It's not going anywhere. So to be a steward of a collective emotional experience that must be processed versus using it to get your idea of how the world should be, right? And exploiting it and throwing, sort of fanning those flames. That's not the refined use of this function. That's not its ultimate form. Its ultimate form is actual, true, again, is the tension that comes along with understanding equity.
A raw obsession with consensus would put more effort on getting everybody on the same page than leading people that are on the same page to some end. In other words, if consensus is your goal, you're not going to have woven into that a lot of leadership or direction or impact you want to make. It's better to have, if we can get the whole world on the same page, it doesn't matter. Let's just get everybody on the same page, thinking that's the solution to the problem. When that's just the first step to get consensus or buy-in or people on your team, now you have to do something with those people. And so sustainability comes in here. When we talk about using negative emotions to create consensus, if you're obsessed with that as an extroverted feeling person or harmony person, that consensus obsession is going to create negative emotions, which are not sustainable, which doesn't actually do any good ultimately. It doesn't actually create harmony. In fact, you're going to end up with more discord than not. And you can see this in movements that have been all about consensus, political and social movements. They've gained a ton of consensus in a short amount of time, to the point where I would say they're almost cultish. I see this across all political perspectives and religious and cultural perspectives. They gather this consensus and all of a sudden the infighting starts. And they're ripping each other apart because once they have everybody's consensus, now they don't know they don't know where to go. There's no end game. It's just get everybody on the same page. Well, now we're on the same page. Well, let's get on the same page again. Let's find more consensus. Now we break apart even into smaller groups because I'm trying to find out, now we're no longer separating by this characteristic. We're going to find another characteristic to make more distinctions around ourselves and create even more consensus. So it becomes a self-feeding cycle that's just like, it doesn't feel good to me. Looking from the outside, I'm not a harmony extroverted feeling user, but I think you're right, that tension point, understanding, hey, we need enough consensus to start to make changes. We don't need all consensus. We don't need everybody on the same page. We need enough people on the same page to start making change and making this sustainable.
Yeah, you and I don't have to believe the same thing. We just have to both believe we want a better world.
Yeah.
We want a world that's better for everyone. And the overwhelming majority of people who are not sociopaths agree with that.
Yes.
Yeah, we all want a world that's better for our kids.
Yeah.
Now, we disagree with what that looks like. But if you spend so much time trying to get everybody to believe the exact same thing, like you're going to spend eternity there and the world will fall apart around you.
Yeah.
But if you give space for people believing different things but still wanting the same outcomes, now you can roll up your sleeves and get to work.
Yeah.
But to exploit people's emotions collectively to try to get your ideas inseminated into the outside world, that's a losing battle. Yeah. And seasoned extroverted feeling knows this. It knows that it's a tension. Tension being you and I believe completely different things, but I can hold the tension between the two things, the two maybe even diametrically opposed worldviews, but I can hold the tension there and still use that tension to turn it into energy, turn it into even positive energy, to sort of, again, steward all of this energy into positive endgames.
So talking about sustainability, if you are a TJ using extroverted thinking or effectiveness, you've been very patient as we talk about the other three judging functions. We're talking about your function now of effectiveness. And sustainability is very important for effectiveness. This is something that matters to you a lot. Setting up a system that can withstand damage to it, it can withstand breakdown, it can be sustainable over time and operate 100 years from now as good as it operates, if not better than it operates now.
Right. The obsession for extroverted thinking or effectiveness is a system that is self-generative.
Yeah.
It's one that never requires maintenance, ever. It's just homeostatic and just is that way in perpetuity. And that is obviously an ideal that can't exist. So this idea of sustainability is like sustainable forever. And that, again, like with all the other functions, when we talked about the things that they wanted, we can't have what we want, but if we keep trying, we can have something that's even better. And I think for extroverted thinking, it's a desire to create these perfect systems that don't require any maintenance, any thoughts. They just run on their own in the background. Since that never happens, it means that people who use this function have to constantly be going in there and retooling it. It's test, iterate, it's split testing. It's trying to, improve upon it over time, over and over and over again. And so what ends up happening is the higher goal of amelioration, which is making things better. How do we constantly improve things? How do we make things better? Now, if a person who's using this function does not give themselves the time and to ameliorate, if they don't give themselves the ability to go back and improve upon the system as opposed to setting it and forgetting it, then they lose sight of this concept of trajectories, which is that a system is either improving over time or it's decreasing over time. There's no two ways about it. It's either on an upward or on a downward trajectory. And so when extroverted thinking sets and forgets things, they don't keep their finger on the pulse of drift. And so it almost by definition will be going the wrong direction. It will be going down. And you see this when it comes to things like setting and forgetting relationships, right? I married this person. I told them I love them. It's done, right? Like the system should be set.
I told you I loved you 10 years ago. I'll tell you if I change my mind.
That's right. I'll let you know if I change my mind. And a relationship is something that has to have maintenance. Like that's kind of, that's the fun of a relationship, is that you're constantly checking in and making sure that, you're recommitting to each other, and like life is an adventure together, right? All those things that make a relationship wonderful and fun. When an extroverted thinking person goes, well, I'm going to marry somebody and it's done, then that will start to drift. It will by definition start to drift because there's always corruption in any system. Just like there's always corruption in any attempt to be, perfectly motivated. Perfect intent doesn't exist. A perfectly clean thought doesn't exist. A perfectly balanced, system of everybody being with consensus doesn't exist. Like perfect consensus does not exist. And a perfectly set and forget system doesn't exist. These are things that just don't exist in reality. These are the idealistic aspects that get brought to every judging function. Now, again, just like with extroverted thinking gets a lot of feedback to help calibrate this, right? It gets a lot of real world feedback that says your system sucks and you need to improve it. But if they get in an echo chamber, and oftentimes, unlike an extroverted feeling echo chamber, which is just like the same thoughts being echoed back over and over again, an extroverted thinking echo chamber looks more like underlings that don't feel permission to reflect back reality to the person who set it up, or creating a system where everybody's so afraid to tell you what the truth is because you'll bowl them over, run over the top of them. Instead of hearing the thoughts you want to hear, it's silencing the voices you don't want to hear. That's usually how extroverted thinking goes about it. Extroverted feeling can do that too. But extroverted thinking is more like it doesn't want to take the ego hit of having set up an inferior system. And because it tends to oversimplify things in pass-fail criteria, sometimes it will give something a pass criteria that should not have pass on it, right? It's actually an inferior system. It's something that's not good enough. But they'll say it is good enough and just keep moving forward. They don't check into the long-term timeline. They don't look at the sustainability of it. They just set something and then forget it, and it was a corrupt system to begin with, and now it starts creating problems. Again, relationships are some of the easiest things to point to, but this can also happen in business.
I think one of the obvious places to see this in the business world is the idea of disruption. A lot of businesses complain. Old businesses say, oh no, we're being disrupted by a new technology or a new, younger, upstart business. And so there's this notion in the business world of disrupting yourself. Come in and have an internal team inside a big business that has new ideas and disrupts the old business before the life cycle of that business runs out, because everything has a life cycle. Nothing is sustainable indefinitely. Everything has a rise, a maintenance, and a fall to it, like an arc, a story arc almost, if you will. And extroverted thinking, I think effectiveness, when it's sophisticated, understands that everything's got a life cycle. So you ride the wave during the height of the life cycle, and as it starts to dip, you have to start something new to catch a new wave and create a new life cycle. And insufficient or unsophisticated extroverted thinking effectiveness believes you can just ride this forever. You start this company, you start this endeavor, you start this career without any changes or advancement. It's just going to continue in the same fashion indefinitely with a sustainable result. And that's just not true. That just doesn't happen in reality.
Yeah, there's a phrase in relationships called conscious uncoupling, when you realize that a relationship is complete, and then instead of, I don't know, like inventing reasons to be mad at each other in order to justify leaving the relationship, you do it consciously. You go, the life cycle of this relationship is complete, so we need to consciously uncouple, and we need to make good decisions to try to mitigate as much pain in the ending the relationship as possible. I would argue conscious uncoupling can happen in the business realm. You can realize that a system, a mode of doing things from the past is now complete. Like the new technologies of the world, the new flavors and the zeitgeist in society. It means that this way of thinking, this way of behaving is complete, and we need to uncouple from it. We can't keep trying to sort of force it to stay alive. I used media earlier as an example of extroverted feeling, trying to tap into fear in order to get an outcome, sort of a social agenda accomplished. But media does this in an extroverted thinking way as well, which is to tap into people's negative emotions to get them to purchase articles to read about them, right? And extroverted thinking can push these same styles of buttons in order to keep their businesses alive. Well, if you're keeping your business alive by hacking into people's negative emotions, maybe the life cycle of what you're doing is complete. Maybe you need to be looking at it in a different way. Doing these dirty tricks in order to keep your business alive is clearly a distortion of the desire to keep these systems going forever. Like, maybe you need to innovate. Maybe a different way is now appropriate. So to get to this idea of, okay, well, the systems don't last forever. There are life cycles to it. I think the higher ethic here is understanding life cycles, understanding that there's going to be time periods where something is done, it's complete, and it's time to move on.
And the effective life cycle, not just the efficient one. I read something recently, YouTube, when you're watching a topic of video on YouTube, YouTube has an algorithm that will continue to serve you related videos in that topic, meaning that the algorithm automatically radicalizes you or pushes you toward researching a certain issue. So if you're watching Myers-Briggs content, for example, or typology content online, you're probably going to be shown a personality hacker video at some point, if it's not a personality hacker video already, on the little side recommended videos. And you're going to get lost in the realm of typology and personality type. More and more of those videos, the more YouTube learns that's what you're after, they're going to continually serve you those videos. You're going to go deeper and deeper with more nuanced understanding, more deeper content. And in some ways, it's very efficient to keep you watching YouTube videos because they already know you're interested in this subject. Let's give this person more of what they want. But ultimately, that's an unsustainable platform. If they keep going down this road, it's going to break apart because you're not cross-pollinating ideas enough. On a long enough timeline, it may take years before it breaks apart and disintegrates. But in my viewpoint, I look at that and I go, that is efficient, not effective. That's a very efficient business model for YouTube to make more ad revenue. But it doesn't necessarily contribute value to the end user in the way that's ultimately sustainable with effectiveness.
Right. And effectiveness, the challenge with it is sometimes it takes forever to really show. And it might be effective for, again, their business model in perpetuity.
It's not efficient in the moment.
Well, what I mean is that what YouTube is doing might be both efficient and effective for their bottom line. But they're not seeing a bigger system, the bigger system of society. Like, is it a good idea to just be feeding people the same content over and over and over and over again? Like, we understand how marketing works. I see an idea like between 7 and 17 times, and all of a sudden I think I want that thing. It's very easy to brainwash a human mind. In fact, it's ridiculously easy. We all are brainwashed. All of us have been through the brainwashing process. And so we know how easy it is to do that to the human mind. So is that better for society in general to just keep seeing the same things over and over? I think that I'm doing well when YouTube gets confused about what to offer me. You know what I mean? Like when I'm watching so many disparate things that YouTube is like, maybe this is the thing that you're looking up, when it kind of doesn't know what to give me. And I have a real wide variety of subjects and perspectives and, and counterpoints. Then I think I'm like, okay, I'm doing this well. And I mean, honestly, YouTube's algorithms are pretty genius in those attempts. The challenge is, of course, that we're starting to now build systems to try to anticipate what we're going to want in order to spoon feed it to us. And this is getting bigger and bigger. This is everywhere. Targeted advertising, reading lots and lots of data on every specific person to try to tailor everything to their experience. There's something to be said for, and this might be extroverted thinking's way to try to honor an introverted feeling individual, but it's not doing it in behalf of the individual. It's doing it because it knows that it will incentivize the individual to take action that will make make revenue in these different businesses, line their pockets. Now, I have no problem with pockets being lined, and I have no problem with doing things that are effective or efficient in those ways. The challenge that we're looking at for extroverted thinking is this ideal of the system just going on in perpetuity forever and working in this self-generative way. And the challenge with that is all of these systems will break down either from the corruption that is written within the system on its own, because every system has corruption, or it will break down because it's not serving a greater good and society itself will be breaking down. And when society breaks down, it's really hard for those societies to be giving money to anybody. And so the systems that created the problem in the first place will also eventually be feeling the results of these systems that they created. Like, just how well was business doing during the riots, right? During protests and riots and cities being on fire, just how well were these systems doing, right? How well were these businesses doing? Some made out like bandits and others collapsed under the weight of them. And so it's a matter of trying to find an equilibrium here. It's understanding that just because something is working doesn't mean that it is a sustainable system, right? It's getting beyond this idea of the obsession with self-generative homeostatic systems that don't need to be looked at. And it's a recognition that the actual greater ethic of effectiveness or extroverted thinking is truly amelioration, right? It's actual keeping tabs on all these systems and asking the system, how can it actually be better? How can it be improved upon? Not how can we get every last drop of dollar bill signs out of this thing. Not how can we get blood from a rock. Not how can we have something live long past its shelf life and force people into this, mold of continuing to use it. But how can we actually make these systems better? Like, I think about, there's a lot of information coming out right now against gig economy. Now, I was a very early gig economy adopter because gig economy actually made my life better. It improved my life because it gave me freedom to be able to set hours, to set different, paces. Like, I was able to do a lot of things because I had a lot of control over my time. Now, they weren't ideal, and they certainly didn't replicate the experience of me being in a 9-to-5. When I was in a 9-to-5, I had a lot more benefits. But when I was in a gig situation, I didn't have those benefits. But I also had a lot more freedom, and the freedom that I had helped me build something else, which then allowed me to create or replicate the experience I had in my 9-to-5. Only now I was master over all of it. Is that for everybody? No. Not everybody works in a gig economy. That doesn't work for everybody. Some people definitely need a more secure position with all of the bells and whistles that come with security, and that's totally fine for them. But what I'm noticing is that there's not just a desire to help people have those benefits that maybe they need in order to rely upon them. What I'm actually noticing is that there's an undercurrent of fear in old systems that are afraid that these gig economy, these new disruptive systems are going to take them over. So whereas the conversation is all about making sure that the individual is honored, the reality is that there's a lot of lobbying that's happening, particularly in government. And government might be one of the most egregious examples of extroverted thinking systems trying to figure out why it can't just set it and forget it, right? I mean, yes, we have new bills that go in all the time. We have all sorts of things that change, on like little leverage points. But the truth is that the government, or at least the government that we live in, really does seem to act like it should exist as it is no matter what, right? Like, we should just all be honoring it even if it's breaking apart. By the same token, because it doesn't update itself, because it doesn't ameliorate what can be ameliorated. And I'm talking about simple things like digital elements. The private sector is so much far beyond the public sector when it comes to digitalization, when it comes to just conveniences of how to engage with it, that it's night and day. It's like I feel like I'm going back in time by a quarter of a century every time I engage with government, right? I'm like, why can't all of these things be updated? Why can't they be ameliorated? And the answer is question marks, because they don't have to, because the government can just do whatever the hell it wants to, and it doesn't have to ameliorate anything. And so what ends up happening is, because we have this relationship with government that says you have to do everything on our terms and we don't have to improve anything. Well, nothing that would actually significantly improve your life and engagement with us. Because of that, we get a distaste for the government in and of itself. So all the things that are working, all the things that are amazing and awesome about the current government, we get this bad taste in our mouth in general. And then we go, well, let's just tear it all down. Well, okay, I don't know if you know this, but it's incredibly difficult to create a government, right? That's not an easy thing to do, and it usually comes with lots of war. So this idea of like, well, let's just burn it to the ground and recreate it is clearly at the foot of, or at the feet, lays the responsibility at the feet of the people who are not ameliorating the systems, right? If you want people to have a positive experience of you, to go, no, there's something here worth saving. Maybe we can just continue to improve it, as opposed to saying like, viva la revolution, right? And then we all grab our torches or pitchforks. Like, if you want people to be in a situation where they see the potential in you, then you have to be ameliorating. You have to be showing them the improvements. You have to be casting a vision of how things can get better over time. And so when extroverted thinking understands that amelioration is the actual end game, not creating a system that is set and forget, that's when it wins people over. And that's when it gets buy-in. And that's when it actually can be on a trajectory of growth, not on a trajectory of disintegration.
Trajectory of disintegration.
It's my new band name.
It does sound like a band name.
It's going to be my new...
a 90s band, right? It's got to be a band name from the 90s.
Or a death growl band, right?
Yeah.
Like the really guttural, like, trajectory of disintegration.
Do you listen to that music, death growl?
I don't.
I know there's some like NT or thinker right now that listens to that. That's one of our listeners right now.
They freaking love it too.
Yeah.
Man, those NTs love those death growls. I don't know what it is.
That's pretty much how I describe most NTs.
Yeah. As a death growl.
You know, I'm kidding, right? That was a joke.
NTs
joke
are the walking personification of the death growl.
Exactly.
To NFs, I guess.
Yeah. And the INTs are very like quiet little death growls. Like, rrr.
They're the ones who are the most into it.
Yeah.
I think it helps them like process emotions. Anyway, we should land this plane. My suspicion is that this has gone very long.
Yeah. What do you think? You've been listening along with us. You can answer about death growl, but more importantly, what do you think about the topic of judging functions, cognitive functions that have ideals that can never actually be realized? And yet there's this tension that can be developed in our judging functions. Come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this episode. Leave a question, add your comment, or share your story about your personal experience in your own life. We'd love to hear what's going on for you.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave a rating and review for us on iTunes, that helps us out a lot. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. And if you leave a rating and review for us on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. And of course, we have an entire suite of programs that are personal growth oriented through the lens of personality type. So if that sounds interesting and you want to invest in yourself, head over to personalityhacker.com, go to the product catalog, and see if there's one that's right for you.
My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.